Hello, my name is Carol Farr. I'm a senior principal with Stantec. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of 3 webinars in Stantec's Moving the Needle Climate Solutions to Accelerate Your Goals series. Today's webinar, Why Now and Why Us, will be presented by Dr. Francis Wiese and Jenny Hughes. Francis Wiese brings 27 years of experience working in coastal and marine environments throughout the world and designing, implementing, and managing large science programs with a focus on climate change, resilience, and adaptive management. A recognized expert in his field, he also serves as a technical reviewer for over 20 international journals and serves on several international science panels, committees, and working groups. Jenny Hughes brings over 8 years of experience delivering infrastructure, development, and energy projects, supporting UK and international clients to achieve their climate change, sustainability, and social value goals. Jenny's background is in environmental management, and she has worked as climate change and social value manager for the UK business for the last year, supporting Stantec's corporate strategy and journey towards net zero. Following the presentation, our panel will answer questions from attendees. Although you will be muted during the call, please type your questions into the Q&A chat area. A certificate of attendance and a link to the recording of this webinar will be provided to attendees following the call. And please also download the handout regarding the next 2 webinars that is attached to this webinar in the handouts section. And now, on with the presentation.
Thank you, Carol. So today's webinar will set the scene and explain the nature of climate change as a complex, urgent, and systemic issue. Whatever point on your climate journey you're on, this webinar series has been put together to arm you with the knowledge, evidence, and stories of why climate change is important and how you can take action. In today's webinar, we'll explore climate drivers, what's causing climate change, climate impacts, what are the impacts of climate change across the world, the consequences of climate change, what are the consequences on the ground and how is this affecting our economy, infrastructure, nature, and people? The business case for change. What's the evidence that climate action should now be taken across all sectors of the economy? And finally, actions. How can organizations and businesses mitigate their impacts and adapt to climate change? There are many reasons why now and why us, and why this issue has never been more important. There's an ecological, a social, and a financial imperative for taking action. It's a really complex picture, so we've broken it down into these sections. These facts and figures have been taken from some of the most up-to-date research and scientific studies across the world. And I'll pause now just for a moment so you can read a few examples. We'll reference and explain some of these facts throughout the different parts of our presentation today. As Carol mentioned, this webinar is the first in a series of 3. So do join us for webinars 2 and 3, where we'll get into a lot more of the detail. Webinar 2 focuses on navigating climate change terminology, and webinar 3 will explore climate solutions that work and how to achieve your climate goals. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Francis, who's going to start us off talking about climate drivers.
Welcome, everyone. One of the big drivers, of course, of why we're even here today is that there's a lot of people on this planet. And you see on this curve here that population growth has been very substantial over the last 100 or 100 and 200 years or so. That drives a huge need for resources. We all need things to live. We have a built environment, etc. And you can see that that has grown pretty much at the same rate. We're using these resources from different parts of the world, and that interconnectivity is shown in this graphic here. Where are the things that we use? Where are they produced? Where are they transported from A to B, and how are they used in the process? All of these things, of course, require energy, and that energy then leads to emissions into our atmosphere, greenhouse gases, that leads to the reason we're here today. This graph here on the top right shows the carbon dioxide concentrations we've measured over the last 800,000 years or so. When I say measured, this is from Antarctic sea ice, where we can measure the concentration of carbon dioxide back in time in very old ice. And what you can see here is this fluctuates quite a bit, right? It fluctuates between 160 or so and about 300. And those are the ice ages that we see the record in the ice. And then somewhere around 1950, we broke this ceiling. We accumulated more after the Industrial Revolution, a lot more greenhouse gases got in the atmosphere, to the point where now we're at 412 parts per million in the atmosphere, a record that hasn't been seen for all this time, and it keeps increasing. So where does that come from? It's important to understand what these drivers are, because if we're going to think about adaptation and mitigation, figure out where these things are come from. Like you see here in this basic statistic here, where it shows some of the percentage breakdown of what it takes, that when we're making things, that it takes about a third or so of the contribution of greenhouse gases. Plugging in is a little bit less than that. So whenever we turn on the light or we put something in the socket, what does that do and how much is? And so this is the contribution of greenhouse gases for that. Growing things, so this is a little bit less than 20% of the food we produce, both plant and animals contributes about 20% of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Transportation is about 16%. This is all modes of transportation. And then temperature regulation is a little bit under 10%. And that is keeping us warm or keeping us cold, depending where you are in the world. Altogether, this contributes to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is trapping heat and making the planet warmer. And we see this in this graphic here, where each color is a year or a decade. You can see that over time, as we get closer to the present, we're always higher. That temperature cycle there around the year keeps getting higher and higher and higher. But it's also not uniform across the planet, and so this spatial difference is important to note. You can see this on this graph here from 2020, and we could put up any year here. And what you see here is that there are pockets that get much warmer than other parts, and in particular, that is true for the Arctic through a process called Arctic amplification. And indeed, the Arctic warms about 2 to 4 times more than does the rest of the planet, and we're starting to see this warming in the Antarctic as well. The other thing to consider is that when people talk about temperature rise, and we see these targets, right, of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, you saw those during COP26, you see them in the media all the time, is that we're well on our way in terms of climbing already. There's been a lot of warming already, and depending on how you benchmark that, if you benchmark it to sort of the middle of the century or the latter part of last century, we've increased our temperature on a global average over 1 degree Celsius already. But again, that is not uniform. And indeed, if you break this down between land and ocean, you can see that there's a difference. So the ocean in blue and the land in red. And that's important because although the majority of the planet, of course, is ocean, the ocean is huge and absorbs about 90% of all the heat we've produced and that we've trapped in the atmosphere. But because water has a huge buffer for heat capacity, its warming has been less. It's been just under 1 degree. In turn, however, the atmosphere and air is much more susceptible to this warming, and it has seen an increase of up to 2%, 2 degrees Celsius. And again, if you look at this in space in this spiral, so imagine traveling through time in the middle and going out and out and out, you can see that during different times of the month, and specifically in February and March, we're getting into here, we've already passed this 1.5 degree threshold. And that's important when we think about the implications. Now, this warming is melting ice. It's melting ice in different parts of the world. It's melting our glaciers and it's melting our sea ice. So the land ice melt is contributing to sea level rise, whereas the sea ice is already in the water. It's not contributing to sea level, but it's contributing to further warming of our oceans and our atmosphere. This graphic here shows satellite images back from 1979, which is when the satellite record began, of Arctic sea ice minimum ice extent in the summer. And you can see that it's gone from about 7 million square kilometers to about 4.5. And this is where we are here today. This is really important because we've lost a lot of sea ice, and that's a lot of white surface that would reflect the heat to the atmosphere normally if it were there, but now it's going into the ocean and then into the rest of the atmosphere. This difference is really big. And so I've put a couple of references here depending on where you are. You know, it's the size of Mexico is the amount of, or half of the European Union, or Alaska and Texas combined, or a whole bunch of different states, Ontario and British Columbia, if you were in Canada, or is this area 7 times of New Zealand. That's how much sort of cooling capacity the planet has lost already. So this change in the Arctic in particular becomes, although it's an impact, actually becomes it's a driver. It becomes an impact in itself and the driver for other things that happen. This animation shows the jet stream that goes around the northern hemisphere. And normally this jet stream, this airflow between cold and warm air should be a nice straight line because there should be a temperature differential between the lower latitudes and the Arctic. But as the Arctic has been warming, that temperature differential has decreased. And now the air, instead of going on a straight line, actually can meander. And you can see these meanders here quite severely. That is really relevant to the rest of the planet. So we're impacting the Arctic, and the Arctic is impacting back us the rest of the world, because now that boundary is messed up. And so now you get cold air that's come much further south, and you get warm air that can come much further north. And that's creating havoc in many places of the world, particularly in the northern hemisphere, creating all sorts of weird weather patterns that Jenny is going to tell us more about.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, so as Francis was just alluding to there, climate change is increasing the risk and intensity of extreme weather events across the globe. The headlines in the news this year have been really quite astonishing. They've also been very relentless and very global in scale. So it's not just one region that's experiencing this, it's really a global picture we're seeing. Some of these pictures summarize the weather events from storms, flooding, drought, heat waves, wildfire, to hurricanes. We started off the year with a deep freeze in Texas, which caused a severe power crisis. Later in the year, many people died as a result of Hurricane Ida. There was widespread flooding across Europe last summer. Meanwhile, in Canada, the heat wave last June set new record temperatures of 49.6 degrees centigrade. Typhoons and cyclones have caused severe damage across Japan, Philippines, Fiji, and Indonesia. There were floods in South Sudan last autumn, which displaced nearly 1 million people along the Nile. The worst dust storm in a decade in China caused flights to be grounded and schools to close, and huge health risks from poor air quality. And a final example on this whistle-stop tour is that South America's river Parana, which runs through Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, is experiencing a severe drought. That's not only impacting the transport of goods and hydroelectricity, but it's resulting in reduced fish catch and wildfires. Those are just a few examples.
Thank you, Jenny. So let's break down some of these because they become really relevant in terms of what some of the impacts are, the consequences end up being on people. So I'll explore some of these biophysical impacts a little bit more as they are quite relevant, we believe. The first one has to do with water. Water, is a problem, not because there's actually not enough water in the world, if you look at the world overall, but usually it's either at the wrong place or at the wrong time, or there's too much of it or there's too little of it. And this is creating a lot of sort of water, what's called water stress. And this is a map of a global index of water stress, and you can pick out your geography there, something that's being exacerbated by climate because we're changing some of the hydrological processes and the availability to water as a result. In the US, this has been mapped in a slightly different way in terms of water supply and water draw. And you can see that's why that map on the left there is slightly different. And then if it's been that water draw need has been mapped with and without climate change on these bottom two panels there, and you can see that this is going to get a lot worse. So thinking about how do we adapt and perhaps mitigate some of these potential impacts with water becomes, of course, really relevant, given that there's millions of people, actually 1 billion people, that don't have enough water, don't have a lack of water access, or water quality is poor for even more people than that. The second one has to do with air. So climate change is impacting air quality quite substantially for a variety of reasons that are listed here on the right, that have to do with heat wave, they have to do with increased ozone, they have to do with particulate matter from more emissions, and they have to do with wildfires that are putting more things in the air. This is affecting a lot of people. It's actually leading cause of death in some areas and has caused the death of over 7 million people worldwide on an annual basis. So there's things here, certainly a good reason, because this affects everybody. It's of course, very indiscriminate. From a biological perspective, we see further impacts, in this particular case, coastal erosion. So the change between sea level rise and more winds, more frequent storms, lack of sea ice in some places where there's sea ice is all making the coastline more vulnerable and we're losing a lot of ground. Indeed, the estimate is that over this period of time that's indicated here between 84 and 2014, we lost about 14,000 square kilometers. This is a net loss because certainly there's accretion in some places as well. But the net loss over this period of time is basically the area of the Bahamas. We believe that in the US alone, we lose somewhere between 1 and 4 feet of coastline. So that's between 30 centimeters and 1.2 meters or so. But in some places, like where I live in the Arctic, we lose after storms, we lose sometimes up to 25 feet or 8 meters of coastline all in one go. And if this trend continues, there's some predictions that say that perhaps all the sandy beaches might be gone, or half of them might be gone by 2100. And of course, this has huge economic consequences as well as to the people that live in those places. And those are things seen already, like in this picture here in the middle center on the top. But it also has ecological consequences, like the one on the top right there, where you see sea turtle eggs that are supposed to be buried in the sand were exposed after a storm, as well as the whole system, the whole intertidal and subtidal system and ecosystem that's being impacted by these coastal erosion processes. So that takes us to really think about ecosystems. So we talk about soils, we talk about air, we talk about water, all very fundamental to life on Earth. And we have all these species and ecosystems that evolve beautifully to adapt and be in that environment that's now changing much more rapidly that many of them can adapt to. And we see that then in extinctions, we see that in a failure of ecosystems to function properly, both in time and space and in quality. So it's a system. And so the system thinking becomes really important, like this graphic illustrates here, where this interconnectivity really needs to be thought of, not as one-offs, because we see many more compounded issues, but together. And therefore the solutions, we need to think about the system thinking and solutions that are more holistic. Nature-based solutions is one of them, but many others as well, some of which we'll explore further. So that takes us to the consequences on people. If we have all these biotic and abiotic changes that we just discussed, what does that actually mean to people? Because, well, we're people-centric. One interesting framework to use is to think about is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And these are listed here, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have already seen those. This first highlighted few there are related to the pieces we just talked about in terms of these biophysical impacts. We want to talk about a few more to talk about consequences to people. Now, certainly all these other ones are also consequences to people, but we don't have time to cover them all. We'll have a few examples and so on, but we'll use the climate change lens, which actually is a goal in itself there in the bottom left is climate action moving forward. And Jenny is going to explore this more.
Yeah, a really useful starting point in terms of this systems perspective is to look at the World Economic Forum's annual global risk assessment, which is summarized on the screen there. Their 2021 research concluded that climate change is the most impactful risk facing the planet. And now, more than ever, after facing the COVID-19 pandemic for 2 years, there's recognition about how interconnected and how vulnerable our planetary systems are. And this map shows how all of these risks are quite interconnected. So during this section, we'll explore the fundamental consequences of climate change for ecosystem services, infrastructure, the economy, energy security and food security. And we'll also talk about the compounded consequences for community resilience and social justice. So Francis gave a really good example of how climate change is increasing the vulnerability of our ecosystems. But what does that mean for people? The image on the left shows some of the services we rely on nature to provide, including agriculture, food, water filtration, carbon storage and sequestration, recreation. Nature's goods and services really are the foundations of our economies. The image on the right demonstrates the links from biodiversity at the bottom and natural capital right up to the economy at the top. We rely on the productivity and resilience of ecosystems for these services that we extract from nature. Climate change is increasing the pressures on these ecosystems and reducing their resilience. So this slide focuses on water as a specific example of ecosystem services. Earlier, we talked about climate change causing global water stress. A consequence of this is the knock-on effect of water shortages and droughts on economies. This graph shows the relationship between rainfall variability and GDP growth in Zimbabwe. The two lines almost exactly mirror each other across this period. Another study showed that a 2-year drought in Kenya from 1999 to 2000 cost at least $1.4 billion per year, or 16% of GDP. Climate change increases the risks for our infrastructure systems and assets as well. This figure is from a UK study of climate change risks to infrastructure. Our assets are at risk from flooding and erosion and stronger winds, for example. The key point, again going back to the interconnections, is that disruptions to one network have a knock-on effect on others. For example, all infrastructure sectors rely on power to function for their assets. And another example is that energy generation equipment relies on water for cooling. The graphic on the right is from a new study undertaken by the United Nations Environment Programme, and it studies the costs and the investment that's needed to adapt to climate change for different types of infrastructure. According to the study, the highest costs are facing our water and building sectors. And in general, it's been argued that whilst a lot of focus has been on investing in carbon reduction in recent years, we're seeing a widening gap between the risk facing infrastructure and other natural systems and the amount invested in these measures. In terms of energy security, we hear about the energy transition a lot. And when we think about the energy transition, it's not just important to consider the source of energy itself. It's a balancing act between, is there enough energy, is it sustainable, and is it affordable for the people who use it? This is sometimes referred to as the energy trilemma. And this graphic is from the World Energy Council study, which shows how countries across the world are performing in terms of balancing these three different priorities. The map summarizes that those top performing include Europe, Australia, and areas such as United States of America and Canada. Those in the bottom performers are arguably going to have a bigger challenge in meeting climate objectives and continuing to balance these three priorities in the coming decades. The consequences of climate change on the global economy could be hugely disruptive and significant. The estimates vary, but basically, the longer we wait to take action, the more expensive it will get. This table here is from a study from the Swiss Institute and tests how global warming will affect different economic regions. It's predicted that globally, 2 degrees could wipe off 11% of GDP from the global economy by 2050. Asian economies are forecasted to be hardest hit. Here's some more examples of headlines from across the world of the costs that could be facing our economy. And now back to you, Francis.
Thanks. Another one that we think about people is food security, or in this case, food insecurity. We think about all these changes in the soils, in erosion, in water, and in air that we talked about before. Those are all fundamental for being able to grow food. This map shows sort of the calories that are needed by different countries that are imported or exported. Now, we could have put a map that shows these changes in terms of being able to have crop yields, for example, and show some of the statistics there, where between 6 or 10%, depending on the crop, is being impacted, and because basically those environments are no longer viable to grow the food that they need. Now, this in turn has big consequences, because if people can't feed themselves, they're gonna have to go somewhere else, and that creates people's migration. And indeed, there's an estimate of over 2 billion people that may have to move by the end of the century because of climate change, and basically climate change refugees. You imagine all the socioeconomic repercussions for that. So being able to adapt and mitigate to this is obviously a very high priority, which really takes us to this, again, this interrelated system. If we think about community resiliency is a result of a variety of different factors that need to be in place. People need energy, people need water, people need food, people need shelter. All of those are being impacted in a whole bunch of different ways, very often at the same time. And that system often is perhaps resilient to one of those, or maybe two things at the same time. But certainly what we've seen is that they're happening together, they're compounded. And that is really messing with the community's ability to absorb these impacts all at the same time, threatening this community resiliency and its sustainability as a result of it. And it is not the same everywhere either.
So in this final sort of human lens, we just wanted to talk about social justice. Climate change is a social justice issue. We can't address climate change without revealing and tackling inequalities that we've currently got within our society. The effects of climate change disproportionately affect those already in poverty, and they can also exacerbate existing economic, gender, and other social inequalities. Francis talked about the potential for climate migrants, and this is not just an issue that's facing vulnerable, less developed countries. There's climate inequality being faced in developed countries as well. This was a really important topic at COP26, and there's been previous frustration that commitments made at the COP15 in Paris for $100 billion a year to developing countries in climate finance have not been met. At COP26, this resulted in a pledge from developed countries to at least double adaptation finance between 2019 and 2025. So we've now answered the question of why do we need to take action? The next question is, can and should we be taking action? And the answer is yes. And hopefully this section of the presentation will give you a little bit more positivity about the potential to take action on climate change. The last section, we talked about climate risks and how interconnected these are and the cost that this results in for the economy. The positive flip side is that there's now a really clear business case for action on climate change at all levels, from the international economy down to the business level. Over the last decade, the political will has shifted and public sentiment now supports action on climate change. This section explores why now, the key factors at play at these different levels, from the national economy to the business level. This graph here is from the Swiss Institute study, the same one that I discussed earlier. And the flip side of looking at the risks to the global economy is that compared to 2.6 degrees warming, if we do meet the Paris Agreement of well below 2 degrees, up to 10% of anticipated GDP loss could be prevented. So meeting the Paris Agreement is the best outcome that we can seek for the global economy. The International Financial Corporation produced a study based on climate change commitments and policies. This was back in 2016, so things have progressed significantly. But the study found that the investment opportunity in the climate change transition and in the green economy was nearly 23 trillion from 2016 to 2030. There's potential for a green revolution, and we're seeing a breakthrough in the speed of cost reduction of renewable and low carbon technologies. Both renewable energy sources and EV batteries have now reached cost parity and are even becoming more competitive compared with alternatives. We're seeing cost curves dipping across all areas of the green economy, including circular economy solutions, carbon capture and storage, and plant-based food. There's also the emergence of a rapidly growing voluntary carbon offsetting market. One of the good news stories from COP26 was the active role played by the financial sector. We've now got $130 trillion of finance committed to net zero through the membership of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And this graphic on the right really showed just how quickly the commitments grew over the last year to that commitment. Members include major asset owners, managers, and banks with the power to mobilize trillions of dollars behind the transition to net zero. In the last section, we talked a lot about the need to adapt and the costs if we don't act. We're also now seeing really a strong financial case for investing in mitigation, particularly as supply chains develop and costs reduce. A US study by the National Institute of Building Sciences in 2019 undertook a benefit cost analysis of natural hazard mitigation, and it found that mitigation can save up to $13 for every $1 invested. And it's not only investors that are backing net zero, and not only that technologies are demonstrating that this is viable, but consumers are now asking for action as well. Younger generations are more concerned about the environment, and their spending has also started to reflect their values. This survey shows that 64% of millennials believe ESG principles will be standard in the future, and half of millennials believe it is a profitable strategy. Millennials and Generation Z will be the current and future employees, clients, and also investors that we're all going to be working with. Another important factor is the rise of environmental social governance in recent years. This has been growing in importance for business stakeholders and investors in recent years. Clients and employees are demanding more ethical corporate practices and are often looking for companies to show leadership in climate change. In a 2021 research paper, it looked at 1,000 different studies over the last 5 years and looked at the relationship between ESG and financial performance. The good news is that it was found it was positive. And managing for a low carbon future improves financial performance. Also, sustainability initiatives appear to drive better financial performance, partly because they result in improved risk management and a bigger focus on innovation for organizations. So all sectors being affected by this case for change. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you a couple of our panelists who are going to give examples from their regions. So first off, I'll pass over to Sandra Schuster. Sandra is an energy transition program manager, and she's going to give an example from North America. Before I pass on to Ru Somawira, a principal environmental scientist who's going to give a perspective from Australia.
Thank you, Jenny. We talked about the energy transition. Why the energy transition? I think it's quite clear why the energy transition. As we change, we decrease our reliance on fossil fuels. We're moving towards electrification. We're increasing our use of renewables, and we are increasing water and energy efficiencies. More than 90% of companies have an energy transition plan. Most municipalities, states, provinces, and regions have climate action goals. Many are starting to forge the roadmap on the way forward, some further along than others. You see oil and gas companies turning into energy companies. You see mining companies with net zero goals, the most ambitious being 2040. The public is demanding it, as you've just pointed out, and investors are demanding it. You're seeing investors divest in pension funds that have assets that contribute to climate change. And you've also addressed the cost of inaction, right? Not only the loss of life, the loss of ecosystems and wildlife, and just the billions of dollars that it costs. The time to act is now. It's past now, and energy transition is first and foremost, particularly in North America right now, where we're about 5 years behind the curve of some of our colleagues over in Europe that have been on this probably 5 to 7 years ahead of us. Now I'd like to turn it over to you, Ru.
Thank you, Sandra. Something from the wild side, actual case study we have been doing. So the interior arid Australia have some very unique ecosystems, like the salt lakes. These are inhabited by a very unique set of animals, like these banded stilts. Now, these animals are restricted to these ecosystems, and they only nest in salt lakes. And their life cycles completely depends on the inundation patterns of these systems. Now, many of these salt lakes are to be mined in the coming years. And my team here in Perth have been finding innovative ways to predict the cumulative impact of mining and climate change on these systems, so the clients can plan effective controls and mitigation steps ahead of their operations.
Great, thank you both for those great examples. So now we're going to take you on to the final section of our webinar, and we're going to focus on actions. We've explored the case for change, and now we're going to start to look at specific examples on the ground of taking action to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So firstly, it's important to talk about COP26 and where are we now after the Conference of the Parties in terms of pledges and action. The Glasgow Climate Pact was agreed in November, and it was heralded as incremental progress rather than a breakthrough, which some people were hoping for. At best, we can now say that with the new pledges, we have an estimate of 2.4 degrees of warming. So progress, but not fast enough. A few other things from the Glasgow Climate Pact. It includes requests that countries revisit and strengthen their climate pledges by the end of 2022. It calls for a phase down of coal and sets up processes towards delivering a global goal in adaptation, higher levels of climate finance, and finance for loss and damage. Over 100 countries joined a methane pledge to slash emissions of methane, and over 110 countries, including Brazil, pledged to halve and reverse deforestation by 2030. That's just some of the examples, and perhaps we'll come back to that in the panel discussion in a little bit more detail. Last year, we also saw huge growth in voluntary industry and corporate commitments being made, which is fantastic news. So what can we do as employees, organisations and communities to take action on climate change? On this slide, we've got lots of examples from a climate action toolbox. The third webinar is going to focus a lot more on how you can achieve these climate action goals. But a few examples of what you can do include setting carbon reduction targets, undertaking climate change risk assessments, implementing internal carbon pricing, and investing in nature-based solutions and renewables. So now we'll go through a few examples of action and projects that we've worked on at Stantec. The EU and the European Investment Bank are the biggest contributor of public climate finance to developing countries. Just one example of a project they've delivered is the Seychelles Climate Change Support Programme. Climate change poses a major threat to Seychelles through rainfall changes, sea level rise, ocean warming, and threats to marine wildlife. The funding provided technical assistance to the Seychelles government to deliver their climate change strategy. Stantec provided international experts who helped strengthen the Seychelles climate change policy framework. Our experts worked with communities and stakeholders to enhance the capacity to access and monitor climate finance. Here's a water sector example from the UK, and the project's called Southern Waters Water for Life project. It aims to protect the environment and maintain sustainable supplies in the longer term. The driver behind this project was the need to reduce water abstractions from a very highly designated and important chalk stream in the area. As a result, there's a need to provide alternative water supplies to meet the 1 in 200 year droughts in the future. The project looked at various options, including a desalinization plant, a water recycling plant, and a water transfer project combined with new reservoir. The options appraisal also included consideration of whole life carbon and climate change impacts. Stantec are now leading the scheme development to refine the preferred option. A final example is that Stantec have worked with manufacturing clients to support them with their climate change disclosures and risk assessments. In line with internationally recognized disclosures, climate risk assessments can be split into two categories: the transition risk and physical risks. Transition risks are the risks your organization might face as the world transitions to a low carbon economy. These can include the cost of carbon emissions, for example. For one client, Stantec looked at transition risks for the supply chain, which can be significant for manufacturers. A high risk was related to steel in the supply chain, which could be subject to carbon costing mechanisms in future, which could increase prices. A byproduct of our study is that the manufacturer also found out they're purchasing more than 2 times the amount of steel they're using. So there's the opportunity to reduce costs and increase their efficiencies as well.
So we want to bring now to our 2 other panelists, please, to the screen here. They're going to provide 2 other examples of potential actions. The first one is going to come from Rachel Bannon-Godfrey, who's the Building Sustainability Discipline Leader in the United States. And her example is going to be about buildings in North America, in the building sector. And the second one is going to be by Johnny Riggle, who is the Director of the Built Environment in the United Kingdom. And he's going to have an example on corporate climate change strategy from Europe. Rachel, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So we work with our building sector clients to help them understand that in order to achieve the progress we really need to see in addressing the climate crisis, every single decision that they make for their operations and their real estate assets really has to be cross-checked back to the impact of that decision on greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk. And I cannot stress that enough, every decision. So a really important first step, because that is quite a complicated mandate that I just laid out, a really important first step is to create a clear roadmap of where you're starting from, where you want to go, whether that's carbon neutral, climate positive, for example, and then a quantitative ranking of the most impactful decisions you can make today, tomorrow, and then at other future milestones. And also understanding that that roadmap doesn't just end. You don't one day wake up and say we're there. It's a continuing process. And 2 key aspects of this roadmap are metrics and accountability and tracking them, and then also understanding the entire system of your influence and your risk, upstream and downstream. And I think we're going to talk about some of that in the panel discussion as well. And so once you have that quantitative aspect and that weighting, that priority and that timeline, that's how you can best prioritize what actions you need to do immediately and understand your business case as well. And I'm going to hand over to Johnny.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. We've been working with a range of different corporate organisations relating to developing climate change strategies. And one reoccurring aspect is the complexity, and we've heard about this complexity already. So many different facets associated with climate change and risks, the ability to adapt and to mitigate. And quite often this creates an emotional response or a lack of action, actually. So we've been working with neuroscientists and psychologists to bring them into the concept of developing and building climate change strategies. Our brain, this operating system that we've got in here, is 300,000 years old. It was honed on the concept of fight and flight when it comes to an emergency. And now we've got an emergency that requires multiple thought processes, multiple complexities, and trying to bring that all together. Now, what we've discovered is this develops something called learned helplessness, this complexities, and learned helplessness stops action. Now, working with different organizations and through a more psychological response to the complexities, what we've actually worked through with many organizations, that most people actually are doing a lot of good things already. And over the last decade, have actually moved the agenda on quite some way. The problem is that the questions are being asked at a faster rate than some of the solutions can be delivered, or even actually questions are being asked at a faster rate than any one individual can learn. New languages appearing, new words are appearing all the time, and I've been in this area for 20 years, and I'm still Googling words that come up that I've never heard of, that are just created on a daily basis, mainly by consultants. So when we try and pick all of that together, organizations need to get back into kind of the long grasp of it, look at those actions that have already been done, understand the nature of those actions, and actually what's being built is an understanding of this whole system, that all of these actions that are need to be taken are actually interlinked with each other, and actually systemizing and systematic nature of these problems are starting to be highlighted. And then what we've learned and what we're good as human beings is actually coming together and collaborating on the actions. Now, collaboration doesn't mean more talking, it means actually working together on delivering those actions. It's no one person's responsibility to deliver those actions, and actually it's no one organization's responsibility to deliver those actions. And within any sector, the supply chain is absolutely critical. Rather than passing the responsibility up and down the supply chains, sectors need to come together and really deliver what is needed within their selected sectors collaboratively, working together, and that is how we get to net zero. We're starting to see the emergence of this now, true proper collaboration within sectors. Francis.
Thank you both so much. And really thinking about delivering the actions, you know, is something that we take very seriously here at Stantec, and of course many organizations do. For us, we try to walk the talk, and sustainability, of course, is an important component of that. Our corporate sustainability, we put a lot of effort into it, and as a result, we really know what we're doing and we know what we're talking about, and therefore can advise people, as you see here, these accolades were received as a result of it. The other thing, of course, is the actual actions, and are we organized, are our institutions ready to implement many of these actions that we have? To help that, we've created this a program within Stantec called Climate Solutions. It's illustrated by this wheel here that you can see, and you don't have to read all these details. Indeed, we're going to have 2 webinars more that are going to focus on a lot of these particular aspects, just to say that we focus around adaptation and mitigation across all our sectors with lots of different tools that we use in our projects, but we use it also at a broader scale as corporate strategies like Johnny and Rachel just mentioned. So I want to conclude with a couple of points. This webinar here is about why, right? Why should we worry about this? Why should we do something? And I hope that from what we've presented, you are convinced, if you weren't already before, that there's a clear social, ecologic, and economic imperative to actually act, and to act now. Act now, because the consequences are just going to get worse. But we have a real opportunity to do something now, financial and ecological, to mitigate these problems. That is actually good for all of us the sooner we do it, and it's going to get harder the longer we wait. So that's, I think, to us, most important how. We believe why us? Well, we believe that Stantec is well positioned to do that because we already doing this for our project. We do this for our own corporations. I think we're ready to implement this part of working together and to delivering these actions like Johnny mentioned.
And to end on a slightly positive note before we go to our panel discussion, we're just going to end on a quote from David Attenborough. "We are, after all, the greatest problem solvers to have ever existed on Earth. If working apart, we're a force powerful enough to destabilize our planet. Surely, working together, we are powerful enough to save it."
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I think this point about working together is absolutely key, is working across disciplines, across sector, across companies with all of you together. So, and talking about together, let's bring all our panelists back in that you met from before. And we've put photos up from them. So if you can turn your cameras back on, that would be great. A reminder, please, if you haven't already, put your questions into the questions chat box. We'll try to field as many as we can in the roughly 15 minutes or so that we have left. You can direct them at any one person or to the panel in general, and we'll try to get at them as best we can. While you're starting to type on furiously, I'm sure there's lots of questions. We went through a lot of topics in these 45 minutes. Let me start by asking one question, and this goes in particular to Johnny and to Jenny. You actually both had the opportunity to be at COP26. We mentioned COP26 in a couple of places throughout the presentation. And we heard a lot of things in the media, and indeed I was scanning the media from different countries as COP26 was happening, and it was very different what people were reporting on. But you two were on the ground, so I'm wondering if you could sort of share your impressions. What did you take away by being there in person?
Am I going to go first there, Denny?
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Johnny.
It was very interesting to be there, and like you, Francis, I was dipping in and out of the media too to see what the response was. Phenomenally positive, actually. The language on the ground was very progressive. People were talking about accountability. More importantly, as well, that the conversation wasn't just at a political level. What we started seeing prior to those 2 weeks and very much after the 2 weeks as well is at a corporate level, the conversation about climate change was being had relating to finance in C-suite at board levels. And that momentum and that progression happened up towards COP26 and has continued after COP26. So for me, it was a phenomenally positive experience. The connections being made there were phenomenally important, both in terms of technology, in terms of policymakers, and as well as the money as well that will drive this forward. So it was a positive outcome in that regard. Time will tell, though, because commitments have to be delivered. And delivered means getting that money to flow through to projects and through to those needs. Jenny, what were your takeaways?
I think a few takeaways from the ground for me, and actually being there in person and hearing about it, was that activism can and does play a really important role in calling world leaders to account and sort of standing outside of that formal process. And I talked earlier about how members of the public and sort of the sentiment of the public is actually incredibly important in driving corporate action as well. I was really pleased that there was a lot more progress and discussion around gender and education and skills, and this is sort of outside of the sort of formal negotiations, but in order to realize the green revolution that we were talking about earlier, there's going to be all sorts of skills that need to be developed and to respond to the emerging industries coming out, and I think that's going to need to be a big focus in the future. I think also the role of science, there was a lot more discussion and importance given to science, and that's left me reflecting as well about how we can better link science with consultancy and organisations to ensure that we're actually making the most informed decisions and plans to take action on climate change.
Great, thank you both for those insights. I think that's a really interesting perspective, certainly different from a lot of stuff that many of us were able to read. Let's think about, so this webinar focused on the why, right, on why we take action, and certainly there's no shortage of reasons to act now and to act significantly, but yet we seem to never quite, it's like Jenny said, it's like your COP26, we were hoping for this step change, and yes, it was an incremental change. There's lots more to be done, and somehow there seems to be some sort of barriers that doesn't quite get there. So I'm wondering if each of you, from your perspective of the sectors that you work with, the clients that you work with, the geographies that you work in, could talk a little bit about what you think are the biggest hurdles for action to occur in your areas. And maybe we'll start with Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I think what I see is two things. One is a reaction to perceived costs, not actual costs, but just those perceived first costs without looking at but Jenny, as your graphic showed, $1 spent is $6 saved. It's not looking at that big picture of where the actual cost benefit lies, and then also maybe not fully understanding risk and the entire complex spiderweb of impacts that will influence a company's risk profile, or a community's profile, or an institution's profile. So it's really, I think there's a level of complexity in understanding risk and where investments should be placed that we're just not seeing the the dots being connected there.
Thank you, Rachel. Rue, what are you seeing in Australia from that perspective?
Yeah, very similar to Rachel, but very specifically, like Australian economy is largely fossil fuel and gas driven, and large part of the regional livelihood, the regional communities are also based on these industries. So there's a huge political, economic challenge in battling climate change. And also because of the vastness of Australia, like most climatic models, if you have seen, they come with a lot of uncertainties and quite complex too. So convincing the general public that there's an issue and these models, that all the science is sound, convincing that there's something happening is a huge challenge here. Like just to give an example, even with just 1.5 degree increase, in my state itself, like Western Australia, some places are predicted to have higher rainfall, whereas others are going to have drought. So convincing a layperson that, okay, there's an issue, this is quite challenging when science is complex. So, so those two, on a regional, social, and an economic point of view, are quite big challenges here.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly a lot more to be done in terms of communication of all these complex issues, for sure. Sandra, what you're seeing in the energy sector in terms of hurdles?
Well, I think the big elephant in the room, and Rue's touched on it, is it's political. It's very political. The polarization now across the globe, it's a huge hurdle. It's also extremely complicated. There is no one roadmap. Everyone's got to try to figure it out. And you talked about this whole systems approach and integration. We haven't acted like that before, and it's a new way of behaving and acting and collaborating. Those two combined for me are two of the biggest hurdles.
Thank you. Yeah, Johnny.
Well, I should have spoken to Sandra beforehand because she's just stolen what I was going to say, which is fairly standard of our relationship, Sandra. And I mentioned it before. For me as well, it's this learned helplessness actually on the actions. It's so complicated. Therefore, can I do anything, or I'll put it off tomorrow? And the relationship between action today for benefit tomorrow is something that has always confused us as a kind of species, as human beings. We tend to live in the moment a little bit more than thinking about 5 years, 10 years time, whether that's about your own wallet and money versus saving for the future. And that conundrum has really played out in related to climate change. Do I take that flight today in lieu of reducing emissions for tomorrow's generations? But really, we're not talking about tomorrow's generation. We're talking about now. We're talking about the impacts of climate change that's happening now, and really to bring those actions as an immediate action, as opposed to disregard them because it's a problem for tomorrow, and really dispelling this learned helplessness, and breaking that down into those actions.
Jenny, looks like we're getting some questions in from the audience. Do you want to go through a couple of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start with this question. What is your view on the role, or perhaps value, of carbon credits, trading and offsets in addressing climate solutions? Who shall I direct that at? Francis or Johnny, do you want to answer that one?
Johnny, I think this is perfect for you.
Yeah, good avoidance of question, Francis. Very important, and ultimately we need to be able to, this goes back to this whole system, we need to move forward on reducing our emissions, mitigating our impact, but also we need to move forward in terms of removing the carbon dioxide that we put up into the atmosphere. We have climate change now. Our planet is warming because of the existing emissions in the atmosphere. We need to start removing those. We have a habit of falling into this process of hierarchy, before you have to do this first, then this, then this, then this, then you offset. Really, we need to think about this far more holistically, and this whole system. Offsetting is part of the process, and getting liquidity and finance into removing carbon dioxide. It's a process also to be able to get money into really important things like protecting our forests and ensuring that our existing forests are not removed for agricultural purposes or for whatever purposes. We need all of this money to be flowing in all of these directions. The language around it is quite confusing. There's lots of different opinions about whether you offset or not to offset and leave it till later. But really, it's part of the whole system thinking. And we need to get money flowing into projects, whether that's removing or avoiding carbon emissions. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. And maybe I'll add that, you know, and we'll talk a lot more about this actually in webinar 2 and 3. But when you think about the carbon credits and offsets and sequestration efforts as well, they're really not all the same, right? And so as we're thinking about different actions and in order to achieve not only your personal the goals of an institution or a government, but also for the environment, there's very different tiers of carbon offsets that do a few things and not others. And we'll explore that more. So different quality and ratings of those. That's a really important to consider moving forward as well. Yeah, great question. Maybe I'll take one. This question is from Anna Pepper. She asked if we could please address mitigation strategies for disparity in resource consumption between developed and developing nations. So anybody have any thoughts on that? That's a tricky, complicated question, but how do we deal with this? And perhaps did something out of COP26 come out of that? Is there something that companies or governments could do in relation to that?
And there, Francis, very much related to, you know, in Glasgow in particular, getting resolution on Article 6. And again, we just talked about offsets a second ago, but getting money into low-income countries, developing nations from developed nations, and make that money transfer across. So really, getting the resolution on Article 6 from the Paris Agreement was absolutely critical to moving that forward, and help getting the money into low-income countries to enable them to go through their economic transitions, to grow as economies in a way that delivers the net zero outcomes as well. So really, that's a key part, and very much from our organisation's point of view, we're keeping a keen eye on how those finance packages, how the bilateral, multilateral agreements are going to be put in place to get the liquidity, to get money into developed nations. Absolutely critical for us collectively on this planet to be working together in that regard.
Thank you. It looks we have a couple more minutes left, Jenny. Perhaps we'll take one more question, and then we'll close it out on time.
Okay, so we had a specific question about Hawaii, so perhaps we can turn to that one. So this question was, what can or should we be doing here in Hawaii right now to address climate change?
Maybe Rachel, you can start with that. We were thinking about systems in Hawaii and how to make those more sustainable and resilient. Perhaps you can share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Francis. Francis and I have been working on a project in Hawaii, and I think there is so much knowledge in the community already. Frankly, I think we are learning from Hawaii and not the other way around. That you know, tap into that. Especially that strong cultural underpinning of any strategies. We've been really impressed with the goals, some of the goals that have been put in place by the municipalities in Hawaii, and they've really kind of pulled a lot of other municipalities in the rest of the United States along, but really tap into the voices in the community that understand exactly what each community needs, that lifestyle that has been in place for so long, that really is highly sustainable, and that maybe, you know, Johnny, you talked about that kind of differences in learned helplessness, or that psychological shift that we've seen. I think we need to go really dig into what the community leaders in Hawaii are telling us about how to live more sustainably, and all hands on deck to meet those goals, because once they're met, particularly around renewable energy, that's the rest of the country will follow suit as well. Francis, anything you want to add?
Well, thank you, Rachel. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think that covers it really well. I want to just thank all the panelists for making the time to be here with us today, the entire audience for staying with us for this hour. There is a lot more questions online. Thank you for contributing those. I think many of those may be answered, hopefully, in the following webinars, or we may follow up with you if we have your contact information. You have Rachel and Sandra here, and together with another colleague, Brendan Player, they're going to actually present in webinar number 2 weeks from today. We have a lot of terminology that we spot out there. There's a lot of acronyms and things, and what does that all mean, and how do you actually do all of that? And we'll talk more about that then. And then our third webinar will be presented by Josh Running and Ginny King, and they'll focus much more on the actions. They'll really dig into examples and all these tools that we gave you teasers for today, but we'll explore more moving forward. So please join us for those. You can sign up in the same place. You also see, go back to the handout tab on your right-hand side there, download that. It has more information. This recording will also be available at some point. We'll send out an announcement if you have colleagues that couldn't make it, or you want to go over something again, because we covered a lot of information really quickly. And Jenny and I's contact information is on the bottom left there. So if you have any other questions, reach out to us anytime. Let's keep the conversation going. Jenny, any final thoughts?
Oh, that was a perfect sum up.
Okay, well, thanks you, everybody. Take care. Have a safe day.
Thank you.
Yeah.